A little bit about SURF, the Summit for Religious Freedom, spelled SRF. SURF is being held April 13th through 16th, both in Washington, D.C. and virtually. It is the hub for our collective fight for religious freedom, church-state separation, and the issues that depend on them, like LGBTQ rights, reproductive rights, protecting public schools, a thriving democracy, and more. SURF is convened by Americans United for Separation of Church and State in collaboration with multiple partners. Virtual events like these webinars ensure the learning, conversation, and networking at SURF continue year-round. We call this continuous programming SURF 365. We're excited to make it available to all of you this year, and please visit thesurf.org, that's the srf.org, for more details. After the webinar, I invite everyone to go to thesurf.org to see the schedule of our programs and purchase tickets. Come check out our keynote speakers like Dr. Anthea Butler, Representative Jamie Raskin, and Aaron Reed. Now a little bit about our organizations participating tonight on the panel. Americans United, or AU, is the only organization dedicated solely to defending the separation of church and state. We are the shield protecting the foundational American principle of freedom of religion, including the right to believe or not believe for all. Stand for Schools is a nonprofit organization focused on advancing public education in Nebraska. Formed in 2017, Stand for Schools has been on the front line of fighting against school privatization in Nebraska, as well as organizing communities to protect Nebraska's already great public schools. And finally, Equality Federation is an advocacy accelerator rooted in social justice, building power in their network of state-based LGBTQ+ advocacy organizations. They work collaboratively on critical issues that affect how LGBTQ people experience the world from cradle to grave, from advancing workplace fairness and family recognition to defeating anti-transgender bills and HIV criminalization laws. It is now my pleasure to introduce our moderator tonight, Nick Nartowicz, AU State Policy Counsel, who will introduce our panel. Take it away, Nick.
Thank you, Brian. So before I introduce the panel, I actually want to start by talking about what we're here today for. Because when people think about legislation, they think about Congress. But the truth is that most of the lawmaking that happens in state legislatures. Each year, more than 150,000 bills are introduced in state legislatures across the country, with approximately 30,000 becoming law. In contrast, Congress passed just 27 bills that were signed into law in 2023. So with that background, we're very lucky to have this group of panelists for today's session to discuss what is happening in state legislatures and how legislators are trying to push a Christian nationalist agenda. So I'll start with some introductions. First, we have Georgia Representative Kim Schofield. Representative Schofield serves the citizens of House District 63, which includes areas of Southeast Atlanta. She was elected to the Georgia General Assembly in 2017 and serves on the Small Business Development, Interstate Cooperation, Health, and Creative Art and Film committees. She has served on several national legislative leadership boards and currently co-chairs the Religious Equality Network. She has more than 15 years of experience in consulting, coaching, teaching, training workshops, and engagement seminars. Representative Schofield holds a bachelor's degree and a master's degree in theology and organizational leadership and a doctorate from Oral Roberts University. Next, we have Daniel Russell, Deputy Director at Stand for Schools. Daniel started with Stand for Schools in 2020 with experience in nonprofit operations and oversight. He's a proud product of Nebraska Public Schools, graduating first from Lincoln Public Schools and then from the University of Nebraska-Lincoln and the University of Nebraska College of Law. Before Stand for Schools, Daniel worked for 5 years at the Nebraska Attorney General's Office in nonprofit regulation and oversight. He then spent a year at iMentor, a nonprofit organization in New York City that focuses on fostering mentoring relationships for low-income, first-generation high school students to support graduation and success in college. Finally, we have Ian Palmquist. Ian is the Deputy Executive Director at Equality Federation. He leads an all-star team of experienced government professionals working to build strong, resilient, and adaptive leaders and powerful organizations that are securing legal protections, improving the lived experience of LGBTQ+ people, and advancing racial equality. He previously spent 12 years at Equality North Carolina, including 5 as executive director. A graduate of the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill, he received his master's in public administration from Harvard University's John F. Kennedy School of Government. So we have a very impressive panel. I want to thank all of them for being here, and I'm going to jump right into the questions. So Representative Schofield, I want to thank you especially for being here because we're in the middle of state sessions and Georgia is in the full swing of things, and it's a very busy time. So I want to start by asking you to talk about some of the work that you've done. So in your bio, I mentioned that you're the co-chair of the Religious Equality Network, and I have the good fortune to work with you as part of that group. Can you please tell us what that group is and why you started it?
Yes, thank you, Nick, and thank you to everyone. It's great to be here with you. Listen, the Religious Equality Network really is a network of great people. And not only that, the purpose of this network was designed to examine the context and look at the construct of the separation of church and state. What we do is we build a strong legislative support. And like you said, it's not just about Congress, it's really looking at the state and all of the support that you can offer to legislators to look at a pluralistic democracy. The time is now. We're beyond our time. And building this partnership means building our power through religious equality that really does counteract the narrative that weaponizes religion. It's not about a view of one view, but that all voices should be at the table. So this network really does equip the state legislators and beyond on how do we deal with those that have a voice in religion or those that choose not to.
Now, you're obviously a legislator in Georgia, which is very religious and has a big Christian population. Can you please tell us why religious freedom and the separation of church and state are so important to you, and that's an issue that you want to work on?
Yeah, I'm a Christian. There's no about it. I grew up in the church. My friend's a Christian. I served on a church body for 6 years. I'm a licensed and ordained minister. And one thing I found when I got into the Georgia General Assembly, that there was one size, but it didn't fit all. And so when we look at the legislation and how it was written, it was really lopsided. And there were a lot of inequities and discriminatory practices that we were using to weaponize the legislation. And when these voices were being embedded in the legislation, there was no one on the other side that was standing up and saying, well, wait a minute, where are those that did not have a voice or did not believe in religion? So it became very apparent to me that all voices, especially Christian nationalist voices, were being made a primary voice. And this was absurd. So it was time that we set a platform to speak for those who did not speak out or speak up. And that's where I came along to say that we just cannot say that is this way and no other voices matter. So becoming a part of the network meant that we were opening the doors to give other voices a chance to be seen, heard, and that there were others that got the opportunity to be represented. And it's not often easy, but it was necessary, and it still is. And so we fight in Georgia for every piece of legislation that would be viewed as discriminatory.
Now, as someone who is Christian but works to support religious freedom for everyone and the separation of church and state, what are the biggest obstacles you face in your work every day in the legislature? And what do you do to try to convince your fellow legislators who might have the same faith that you but have a fundamentally different view about how faith and how religious ideas should be legislated?
Well, here's the thing. The number one thing is the fear. If you can overcome that fear of being isolated or being ashamed, then you can possibly get some work done. And then the bias that is associated with feeling judged and judgmental. There is a time and a place for everything. But when you're, again, looking at one-sided, this is not a time and a space where we're using our religious views to demand that the voice is heard. You cannot weaponize and use religion as a tool to weaponize legislation. That's not what the body should be using this platform for. So I'm a reminder and giving my colleagues space to say, it's okay to say no. It's okay to say that this is not what we're going to do, and that Georgians who don't believe what we believe deserve better. And now we're finding out that there are more Georgians that really want a voice that is neutral, if not a Georgians that are equitable when it comes to religious freedom. So it's finding that space and giving people a freedom to say it's okay.
Yeah, I will say I'm so grateful to work with people like you, because it's one of those things where a lot of times, we need more people who are people of faith to speak up and say, I'm very firm in my beliefs, but that doesn't mean that I think we should legislate them. And I'm really grateful for the work that you do in that space. So thank you very much. Okay, so I'm going to change focus a little bit and turn to some of the bills that we're actually seeing in state legislatures this year. I think it's fair to say that there are some pretty clear trends in state legislation that span across the country. We're seeing unprecedented attacks on LGBTQ plus people, particularly trans people and trans youth, and a continued push to create private school voucher programs. These are different bills, but they have the same underlying thread of Christian nationalism. So I'd love to talk about these themes. And Ian, I'm going to turn to you first for this. Can you tell me what you're seeing across the country when it comes to attacks on LGBTQ people in the state legislative space?
Yeah, thanks, Nick. I think a lot of folks probably know that last year was the most intense year we've seen of anti-LGBTQ legislation, I really think, in the history of the movement. And we're continuing to see a lot of those trends this year. Right now, we're tracking 262 anti-LGBTQ bills at the state level across the country. And we're seeing some familiar trends and some new threats emerging this year. So some of the things folks are probably familiar with. We've been seeing athlete bans that prevent transgender young people from playing sports on the team that matches their identity. We've seen a revival of bathroom bills that limit trans people's ability to access appropriate restrooms, locker rooms, and sex-segregated spaces. We're seeing a lot of attacks on education and curriculum censorship. You've probably heard about Florida's Don't Say Gay and Trans law that passed last year. We're seeing attempts to put similar restrictions around the country to limit factual, basic information and really to erase LGBTQ people's identities from the classroom. Probably the most horrible trend we've seen has been the attempts to ban gender-affirming care for transgender people. We've now, as of January, when Ohio's bill was not signed by the governor, but the veto was overridden, we have 22 states that have banned access to best practice medical care for transgender young people. And what we're seeing now is many states that have done those bans are now coming back and going after transgender adults, trying to limit access to gender-affirming care through public funding like Medicaid, and through taking a page from the anti-choice movement and putting trap laws in place that put really harsh restrictions on clinics that offer basic medical care for trans folks. A couple of the new things we're seeing this year too are so-called Women's Bill of Rights, or sex definition bills. These are bills that do absolutely nothing to address women's rights, who I think we all know are very much under attack in this moment with Roe being overturned, and instead focus on putting very narrow definitions of sex into state law across all of the general statutes. And that can affect not only trans people, but in some cases, folks who are infertile or folks who are postmenopausal. We're also seeing so-called parents' bills of rights. These are often kind of a hodgepodge of all of the bad things that I was just talking about. It varies a little state to state, but they're really trying to tap into this idea of parents' rights when in fact, they're taking away the rights of parents to decide what books their children can access, and parents to decide along with their doctors what kind of affirming care their children might want to access. So those are a few of the things that we've been seeing so far this year.
So you mentioned that last year was an unprecedented number of bills, and also specifically the return of the bathroom ban bills. Why do you think there have been so many more bills introduced and passed over the last few years? What has led to this really sharp increase in these bills?
Yeah, we've seen these anti-trans attacks really starting back in 2015. After the win on marriage, the opposition really pivoted and started focusing on attacks on transgender people. The growth that we've seen is not an accident, and it is not coming from a grassroots uprising across the country. It's really being manufactured by organizations like Alliance Defending Freedom, the Heritage Foundation, and the American Principles Project, who are drafting, in many cases, this legislation, working with right-wing legislators to advance them. And these groups, I think it's really important to name, are not just focused on hating trans people. They're also advancing anti-abortion policies. They're also working to ban accurate history about race and slavery in our schools. And they really are working together to use these issues to mobilize a very narrow but extreme base on the right wing of the Republican Party. So our organization, our opposition, is really made up of some of the same organizations that have been coming after so many of our communities for many years. And now they're really homing in on fear and misunderstanding of trans people to try and turn out their base.
Yeah, those are definitely some organizations that we see. I mean, I'm well familiar with the Alliance Defending Freedom, who does a lot in general in our space to push for more kind of religious Christian nationalist ideas. And we know that these things are all related for sure. So there have been some tough losses this year. You mentioned the Ohio legislature overriding the governor's veto of a trans medical care ban. But there have been some wins as well, such as in the West Virginia legislature, they were actually able to defeat 29 of 30 anti-LGBTQ bills. And California dramatically increased access to PrEP, which of course is the medication that helps prevent the spread of HIV. So what strategies or tactics work to defeat bad bills or help pass good bills?
Yeah, great question, Nick. So I think, first of all, just to name, it's so important that we have strong LGBT advocacy infrastructure in every state, because we have to be fighting these battles, not just in state capitals, but also at the school board level and at the city council level in many places. So we're really working to support our partners with the resources to fight back. And really looking not only at how do we fight back in this moment, but what is the work we do as a movement to change the narrative and build public support for trans people so our opposition can't use this as a wedge issue. Some things that I think are really working, we're seeing unprecedented mobilization across the community and from our allies, including faith leaders in many cases, who are coming to speak out and defend LGBTQ young people. Bringing national attention to this wave of legislation has caused some states to step back a little and think twice about moving forward. Of course, it's absolutely vital that we have strong allies like Representative Schofield in office in our state capital. So election time is absolutely critical to make sure that LGBTQ+ and pro-equality voters are engaged and turning out. And then finally, I think the last thing I just say is it is so vital that trans people and their families are speaking out and recognizing that that's often dangerous. That's not safe for everyone in our community to do. But for those who are able to, we have seen a real impact. We have seen legislators change their mind when they meet a transgender young person. And we've seen even some Republican governors who have vetoed anti-trans legislation just from that experience of talking with trans people and their families. So I think it's just, again, that lesson we've learned many times in our movement, that telling our stories and sharing who we authentically are is really critical to every step of the fight.
Thank you. Okay, I'm going to move to Daniel now on the topic of private school vouchers. And I want to say I really love that in your bio you include a proud product of Nebraska public schools, because I often sell myself as a proud product of public schools. I went to public schools in 3 different states, and I think it's one of the reasons that drew me to this work, actually. But so your organization, Stand for Schools, has worked for years to protect public schools and our public education system by opposing private school voucher bills that use taxpayer money to fund private school education for just a few select students. So why is this issue so important? Give us vouchers in 30 seconds now.
I'll try my best. And thanks so much for having me, Nick. And I think your question really gets to the heart of the issue and why this is so important about funding education for just a few students. But I like to kind of think about vouchers in sort of two different ways. So first is a value proposition, and second as an evidence-based proposition. So as an issue about values, we see there being a lot of really great small d democratic, inclusive, like Representative Schofield said, pluralist, community-minded values that the public school system embodies. So we at Stanford Schools think very deeply about those values and what it means to have an education system that's only accessible to a certain type of student, or an education system that's not responsive or accountable to the community it serves, but rather to market forces. So certainly when we think about how a state should spend its resources, we insist that those resources go to systems that are democratically accountable and that serve all students regardless of who they are, or who their parents are, or where they are in their educational journey. So that's sort of the values proposition. And then the second way to think about vouchers is kind of as a matter of evidence, right? We look closely at the research around school vouchers, and we want to figure out whether or not they, as a matter of policy, are effective. And what the research has shown is that the more recent and the larger the voucher program is, the worse student outcomes are. And there are a lot of really great researchers on this topic, but I want to shout out Dr. Josh Cohen, or Cowan from Michigan State, who's been a real leader on this issue. So to answer your question, school privatization is important because one, it's just not an effective policy to achieve better academic outcomes. And then two, because it also goes against the shared values that we all have around the role a public education system serves in our society.
So last year, despite your best efforts and the best efforts over years of working to fight it, the Nebraska legislature did pass a private school voucher bill. But you, and working alongside a number of other pro-education groups, have been fighting have been fighting it for years, like I said. So what happened last year that finally allowed the people pushing the voucher to get it over the finish line?
Yeah. So as a result of term limits, we had a lot of new senators in the body who, and I don't mean this to denigrate them or in a derogatory way, but they were new. So they took some time to figure out the lay of the land. And moreover, many of those senators were replacing long tenured moderate members of the body that just were not fans of vouchers. So we have this new crop of senators that maybe didn't know much about the issue, maybe didn't have strong feelings one way or the other, but did suddenly have to deal with the political realities of working here in Lincoln. And one of those political realities is that the main proponent of vouchers in our unicameral is very powerful. And with all due respect to the Speaker of our legislature, this senator is probably the most powerful senator. And so you get this kind of perfect storm of a very powerful senator working with a group of freshman senators who are still trying to figure out exactly how independent they can be on a particular issue. And they're working on this issue that she herself has dedicated her entire tenure to. So that's kind of the short answer. I think the important context in Nebraska, though, is Nebraska has this really long history of not opting into the latest trends in school reform. So Nebraska doesn't have charter schools. We resisted a lot of the high stakes testing that accompanied No Child Left Behind. And like you said, until last year, we didn't have a voucher program. There are probably a lot of explanations as to why that is, but certainly an important piece of the puzzle is that for many years in Nebraska, there was this bipartisan consensus around supporting public education and also these very conservative values around trust of local leaders who would do the best for their communities. So I think you get all of that, and then you also add legislators and state elected officials are competitive. So for a long time, Nebraska was one of only two states without any school privatization legislation on the books. And at our hearing for the voucher bill last year, the governor came in and said, we need to pass this bill so that we don't fall behind our neighbor Iowa. Now we can talk about the Iowa school voucher program and how it's, a couple $100 million over budget and the impact that it's had on tuition in Iowa's private schools. So I think there's a real question about whether or not that's even a competition we want to be in. But I don't want to downplay the fact that school privatization is a national movement, and Nebraska is not immune from that national trend. And so you get all of these things together, and finally, after years and years of work, they get a voucher bill across the finish line.
Yeah, we definitely saw an inordinate number of states enact voucher programs last year. It was a lot of states where I had been working with people on the ground like you to fight them for years that finally just fell and were able to enact either new voucher programs or especially a lot of universal programs where every student in the state is eligible. And it was a very frustrating time. But in Nebraska specifically, there was a coalition of organizations, Stanford Schools included, that worked incredibly hard to collect enough signatures to put this bill on the ballot, and which will allow voters to decide in November if they want to overturn the voucher program. And historically, every time vouchers have been on a ballot, voters have rejected them. So I have a two-part question here. First, why do legislators fight to pass bills that are unpopular? And second, can you tell me what work about the work that you're doing to ensure that vouchers are defeated in November?
Yeah. If I could tell you why legislators fight for unpopular bills, I absolutely would. And I know I'm talking to AU right now, but at a certain point, it's probably something only they and their God really know about. On school issues in particular, though, I think what we've seen not just in Nebraska, but across the country is a very well-worn playbook around discrediting public education. So there's that Chris Rufo quote, "To get universal school choice, you need to operate from a premise of universal public school distrust." So, I mean, I don't think it will surprise anyone on this call that there has been a real concerted effort to get to a place of universal public school distrust in this country, whether that's scare tactics around critical race theory, or now it's SEL and DEI, or demonizing LGBTQ students. We actually had a senator talk about litter boxes in schools on the floor a couple of years ago. And that movement has serious backing. So, maybe an answer to that question is it's probably easy to start believing some of those things because there's this national movement behind discrediting public education. But what we found is that even for skeptics, public schools are very much like Congress, right? In that when people think about public education and the system, they maybe have a negative reaction. But when they think about their public school, my public school is great, right? My public school is the exception. So one of the things that we really try and do is tell people like your public school and all other public schools across the state are doing great work, and to really spread the good news about public education in this state, in Nebraska, and in the country generally. So as you mentioned, one of the really cool things about Nebraska is that we have this referendum process, which acts as sort of a heat check for exactly what you're talking about when legislators pass unpopular bills. So as soon as the voucher bill passed last session, Stanford Schools and a coalition of a bunch of other groups did exactly what we had been saying we would do. We took this to the voters, right? And we appealed to them to get signatures to put this on the ballot in November. So we had 90 days to collect 60,000 signatures, and we collected 117,000. We had to get at least 5% of registered voters to sign a petition in 38 counties, and we got more than 5% in 64 counties. So right now, our focus is to really ride that wave of momentum from last summer into the fall and explain to folks what vouchers mean for Nebraska and for their public schools, and then organizing folks to get out and vote. And I'm going to knock on wood that we continue that streak of vouchers being defeated at the polls.
Thank you. And yeah, I actually make the same comparison between the people, what they say about their congressman versus Congress, and the same thing with public schools is that they're always, mine is great, everyone else's is terrible. And it's like, well, why do you think just yours is great and no one else's is also great? So yeah, I love that comparison. Okay, so Representative Schofield, can you tell us about some of the bills that you've been working on in Georgia, either to pass good bills that you think are doing good things or ones that you're working to defeat?
Yeah, and so I love the strategies. Thank you, Daniel. I mean, we do have, when we talk about reproductive freedom. You know, I have a constitutional amendment trying to get it on the ballot to actually see if we could bring it to the voters about reproductive justice. Let us make our own decisions. It is about our choice and our voice. And so, of course, that didn't get a hearing, but we're still going to fight. And it goes to the point of us again mobilizing. And advocacy work is it's not a legislative session work. It is a 367 days, because you always have to add 2 extra days in there in case someone takes a vacation or goes to sleep. But it is a time that we start owning some of these things. And so work and bills around protecting the rights, SB 180, which is a bill that is a discriminatory bill that is really actually in Georgia hurting the LGBTQ plus. And so it passed out of our Senate, coming to the House, and we've been fighting to stop that bill, stall that bill out. Again, it speaks to some of the things that Ian was saying, and taking away the rights. And you're couching it as this is going to help our religious freedom, but it's not. We're looking at stopping bad bills on the parental rights and looking at the language on the reproductive rights. All of these are just bad bills. So, you know, we didn't get a lot of hearings on the bills that we're trying to push. So rather than waste a lot of energies, we're just working with coalitions on stopping these bad bills before we've got, I believe it's like 5 days left. So what can I do in 5 days, but then continue this work across the summer to get people out to raise those voices. And I know we'll talk about the strategies on how do we keep people engaged and mobilized and really keep them fired up. And that means, you know, using strategies like you're doing in Nebraska. And you're talking about, Ian, on how do we keep them mobilized and working with these coalitions and making sure that you're showing up, not just at the Capitol, but making sure you're showing up at town halls and working with your council members and your commissioners. And folks have to hear our voices. It's not time to be silent. As you're going into these election seasons, this is the time where you have to bring people with you and having these coffees and making sure that you're talking to them on social media and asking questions on their social medias. You know, where do you stand? Start asking the questions. Where do you stand? How do you feel about so-and-so? What is your position? Writing op-eds. There's no reason why we cannot start controlling a little more of the narrative and start being so reactive instead of being proactive. So our session is over, but that does not mean that we stop the process. The train left the station. I'm not getting off on the next stop. I'm staying on and keep going forward. I keep telling people, Kim stands for keep it moving. I keep going, keep it going. Keep it moving.
I love that. Okay, so I know actually you kind of segued perfectly into my next section, because I'm sure a lot of people that are listening today and are hearing this information are wondering what they can do in their states. So I want to hear from all of you about how you do your jobs and how activists can fit in. So Representative Schofield, you talked a lot about the different ways people can engage, but as a legislator, what is the best way that you find that constituents engage with you, like in order to make their positions known to their representatives?
You know, for me, I stay in the front. So you find me anywhere on social media, you find me at the grocery store. Your legislator has to know you. They have to know what pushes your button. You have to know what pushes their button. So again, that's reaching them. Find out everyone on this phone should be already signed up to your legislator's newsletter. You should be getting their newsletter. You should be following them on their social media. You should know who their admin are. You should have a connection with their admin. You should find out when we leave legislative session, that doesn't mean we're done. Find out where we are in our district. You know, again, the best way is to start doing op-eds, start doing articles, Start finding out, getting together with mobilizing your students. Find out where the students are in their districts, and sit down and have meetings with them. Talk to them. Talk to their parents. These are the ones that the younger students, the college students in those areas, they are going to be the potential voters. My group of students, although they can't vote, what I have been working with is those students go home and tell their parents, I know you may not vote, but I can't vote. So I need you to go vote on my behalf. So I start working with the younger kids, and they get fired up when legislators don't want to do something. And I'll just say this, I work a lot with taking the tax off the menstrual products. My little girls get fired up because they don't want to pay taxes. So they go home and tell their parents, listen, you may not believe that politicians do anything, but my Representative Schofield wants the tax. I want that. I need you to go vote. And the parents go vote. They listen to the kids. So we have to start looking at other ways. And believe me, mobilize, mobilize, mobilize. That's how we get it done.
Great, thank you. So Daniel, Stand for Schools, of course, is a professional organization doing this work. How do you work with people on the ground and regular Nebraskans to fight back against school vouchers and for public education?
Yeah, so like you said, Stand for Schools is a nonprofit advocacy organization. So that means we spend the majority of our time doing sort of grassroots organizing, trying to spread the message about the great things that are happening in public schools, and then also being on the lookout for ways that we can make them better. One of the reasons that Stand for Schools exists, at least in Nebraska, is that there were a lot of kind of school groups that represented a particular subset of the education ecosystem, right? So the teachers have a union, and the school boards have an organization, and the administrators have an organization, but there wasn't really anyone whose sole focus was on looking out for public education in general. And I think one of the really great things about this job is learning that these groups like Stand for Schools exist all over the place. So as far as people fitting in, for if you're concerned about school privatization or concerned about what's going on in schools, there is almost certainly a group doing the work that we do here in Nebraska in your community. As far as ways you can fit in, though, what I would say is, I would also just echo everything Representative Schofield said. She knows. But also, I would say that if you've taken the time out of your day on a Wednesday night to listen to us, you're probably already in the top 1% of educated and active people in your community. And that probably means you're involved with groups whose mission might not be, in our case, education focused. But when we were working on the referendum campaign last summer, some of our best support was from individuals and groups whose sole focus was not education, whether that be the League of Women Voters or the NAACP or disability rights advocates, or, Americans United is not solely focused on education, but you're an incredible partner for us. And so recognizing sort of the intersectionality or how those things all relate together, and forming coalitions with people and groups who might not be totally focused on your particular issue has been a huge strength for us. And that's something we hope to continue to do. So that would be my, addition to this, is how people can get involved, is really think about the groups that you're already in and how you can get them active on whatever issue you care about.
Thank you. Okay, and then one last question before we get to the audience Q&A for Ian. So you work for a national organization that's fighting legislation from distance. So how do you support the dozens of Equality Federation member groups to help them be successful?
Yeah, our state organizations are the folks on the front lines, and they're really, heroes for us. Our work is really all about lifting them up. Many of them are small and under-resourced. I think about a group like Louisiana Trans Advocates, with just in the last 2 years hired their first full-time staff person, and yet have been incredibly effective at killing bad legislation and even finding under-the-radar ways to make progress for the community. So our work is really all about supporting our network to do their jobs better and to make their work easier. So that looks like a bunch of different things, but just for example, we run a legislative contact program, so they can just call us and say, I need constituent calls going into these 3 legislative offices ahead of a committee hearing. and we can have those up and running the next day. They can call us and say, this brand new kind of bill emerged. How do we even talk about this? We haven't seen anything like this before, and we help connect them to the best messaging we can find. And we also just support them directly and financially. We do our best to see where we can raise resources nationally that we can pass directly out to the folks in our network. And then the last piece I'd say is just, we really believe that this is a long game. You know, a 3-month or 6-month campaign is not how we're going to win equality and justice for our community. So we're deeply invested in providing leadership development and organizational development support so that organizations can grow, so that leaders who are doing this incredibly hard and incredibly personal work can be supported and can stay in that work and can continue to be more effective. So really, it all comes down to how can we help them do their jobs better.
Great, thank you very much. Okay, I will turn it over for some Q&A questions.
All right. Yes, thank you. So we have a lot of really great questions. So I'm just going to ask folks to answer in the shortest way that you can, so we can get to as many as we possibly can. First question, Ian, I think it's probably good for you. Bill is asking, how do we combat a bit like a "Don't Say Gay" bill here in Ohio? It sounds like where Bill is, when they have a supermajority legislature that they don't feel is listening. How do we fight when it feels like there's an overwhelming odds against us in the legislature? Because there are wins. So what are you seeing?
Yeah, no, that's a great question. And in some states, it is really challenging to fight back. I think the thing that I hold on to is that you never know exactly where you're going to be able to find an opportunity to stop a bill. Sometimes it's in committee. Sometimes it's getting it into the not even be heard in committee. Sometimes there's some backroom trade-offs that need to happen between legislators. But all those things only happen when the community is mobilized and engaged. And sometimes we can't make it happen. Sometimes no matter how much we do, we're not able to stop bad legislation. But what we are able to do is to educate legislators for the long run and educate the community as well, so that hopefully we can come back and address those in the future. And of course, you know, lastly, you know, we just have to get our folks out to vote in elections in order to make some of the changes that we need.
Great, thank you. Representative Schofield, I think a lot of folks on our webinars are always surprised when people of faith and faith leaders are standing up for church-state separation. It's a common misnomer. Rabbi Adele, who messaged us, was standing up for that and reminding us that many of the religious teachings do not teach that Christian nationalism should be imposed upon others. And so can you just talk a little bit more about, you know, how as a faith leader, your faith calls you to live this fight, and that not all people of faith believe that Christian nationalism is the way to go?
Yeah, my faith, you know, every Tuesday we come to Bible study, and we talk about the word, we pray together, we hear each other. And at the end of the day, when we pray together, we go out there, and I want to say everybody acts like they are on the other side, that we went through nothing. So you have to know where you stand every day. And so I understand that my only responsibility is to go in there with a mind that says, why am I here, and what I believe. I believe that I am to love God, love the people of God. I am to serve and be obedient. And that means doing the best that I can. Am I always going to be right on this? No. But I do not have the right to impose a viewpoint on that is going to hurt people. And I see that happening all the time. So my faith has to be grounded in what I know. And I cannot, you know that when you're doing wrong. And that's where I have to lie and draw my line in the sand, saying everybody has their core value, and you know right from right. That's where I have to lay my ground in the sand. We have the religious teaching. You got to weigh that. There's no easy solution. Just weigh it. So, you know, apples to apples. That's all I can say. And I'd love to have some more conversations on this. I don't want to take up a lot of time.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Daniel, we have a number of questions about vouchers, and I'm going to see if I can twist them all into maybe one. So one aspect of the voucher question was, can you just talk a little bit more about the evidence that your research or the research has shown about vouchers not being effective, which is why it's so important that we're fighting against it, along with the fact that it goes to so many schools that can just discriminate. And then the second half of it from Janet mentioned that Illinois seems to be going in a positive direction, where they're letting their voucher program sunset. And maybe you and Nick could talk about, are we seeing this maybe as a counter trend? Are there opportunities for more programs to sunset or begin to roll back? So a two-parter.
Yeah. So on the first question about the evidence, like I maybe mentioned, Dr. Joshua Cowan from Michigan State University is really the leader on looking at evidence around academic outcomes in voucher programs. And what he has found is that kids who transfer from public school to private school do worse, actually, in their new private school setting. And that's sort of counterintuitive to a lot of people, because we have this view of private schools as like these shining, schools on a hill, right? Like these are the things that we're all supposed to be aiming for, and they give the best education. But in reality, what happens is these voucher programs incentivize kind of, I think Dr. Cowan calls them subprime schools, basically, right? So these are fly-by-night schools that open in the strip mall and maybe show Khan Academy, or, they're not actually the rigorous private schools that maybe we have in our minds as like the best of the best in education. And so, especially when you have these broad-based programs, there's more and more incentive for these types of schools to open, because there's all of this state money available for these bad operators to kind of get in there. So I would suggest looking at Dr. Cowan's research. And I think if you just Google Joshua Cowan voucher research, a lot will come up on that. One of the more shocking things that he found is that in Louisiana, Ohio, and Indiana, I'm hoping I'm getting those states correct, the effect of the voucher program was actually worse than the COVID-19 pandemic, which is wild to think about, right? That these programs could have such significant detrimental effects for their users. But that is what that research is saying, and especially the most recent kind of research. So hopefully that answers question one. And then, okay, remind me again, Brian, what question two was.
For you and Nick, this Illinois voted to allow its voucher program to sunset. Might we see more of this? Are there positive trends or positive things in the fight against vouchers that we're seeing in states?
Yeah, so I guess I would say two things about this. Number one is hopefully yes, right? I think that especially in education, there have sort of been bipartisan consensus around education reform. So whether charter schools or whatever, and in particular, people like Democrats and liberals are kind of waking up to this idea that we just need to fund our public schools. We need to support our public schools. We don't need to reform them. And so that's really wonderful, because like I talked about earlier, public schools sort of represent the best, at least in my mind, of what we can be as a society, right? Inclusive and open and available to everyone. So hopefully, yes. But also, I will say that with a caveat, because I think the real trend now, particularly among conservative education folks, is not vouchers, it's ESA programs. So these are just savings accounts where the state puts, 10 grand in an account and then you can spend it on whatever. We look at Arizona in particular has a really gigantic ESA program. And, people spend that money on Lego sets and trips to Disney World and SeaWorld and, non-educational baby grand pianos, non-educational things. And I think that really is maybe going to be more of the push that we see in the next 10 years around education reform is like, let's just give this money to parents. And that, worries us to no end because, gosh, you want to talk about unaccountable spending at the state level. Those ESA programs are, rife with abuse. So maybe some good news and some bad news. I don't know. I'll kick it to Nick to see if he has anything to add.
Yeah, so first I'm going to plug the National Coalition for Public Education, which is a coalition of national organizations that oppose vouchers, which AU co-chairs. And so on that website, which is ncpecoalition.org, there is a lot of information, including studies, a lot of the studies that Professor Cowan references that have been done on vouchers across the years, and especially the longer standing voucher programs that do exist. There's also a toolkit that NCPE created. Yes, thank you. The link is now in the chat. That we have sent around to lots of, actually, Daniel has gotten copies of that toolkit. And that is really designed primarily for advocates and legislators. But if you're wanting to know more about vouchers, that toolkit is a great place to start to understand what the problems are with vouchers and the many arguments against them. As well as, again, there's lots, just so many resources on that website. It's designed to be a resource. So I would encourage people who want to know more to look there. And actually, one of the main arguments we've made historically against voucher bills is a lot of times they will suggest some sort of pilot program. So it's only intended for lower income students or students with disabilities. And it's going to only exist for 5 years. And what happens is you enact that program, and anyone who works in government knows it's much easier to enact something than to repeal it. So once it's there, it like sticks. So you'll enact the small one and you'll say, oh, well, who wants to argue against low income students? So we're going to raise the income cap, and it slowly creeps up. And for years, that was what we saw happening. And that was the only way vouchers could get passed, because that's, you take a sympathetic group and you say, we want to give these students more support, and this is the way we want to do it. And people will say, okay, we'll try a small version. And then it just never goes away. Florida's first voucher program started as a small pilot program. They now spend over $1 billion a year on vouchers, 20 something years later. So Illinois is unfortunately a rarity in that there was a sunset date and they let it expire. It had been extended in the past, but they finally let it expire. But now we really are seeing legislators and the pro-voucher groups just push for straight universal vouchers. Even if there is a existing voucher program in the state, they will just say, we want to create a statewide ESA so every student in the state is eligible for that education savings account voucher. So they've realized they can just go for the grand prize because they have enough members in the legislature now. So it is unfortunately not where things are going. But I do think, as we see kind of what Daniel said, as we see more pushback against vouchers, you might see states with more Democratic legislators that have voucher programs maybe start to roll them back. We've actually seen in Arizona, although the legislature is still Republican dominated, the Democratic governor who's newly elected is pushing back against that universal voucher and trying to lower it because there has been so much abuse and fraud in the voucher program. And so that people are really realizing the many problems with vouchers and realizing we kind of, it's the dog that catches its tail, or actually catches the truck, right? And they're realizing they've caught themselves, and now they're blowing holes in their budgets because of these gigantic voucher programs.
Great, thanks. Ian, a question from Sean, a good news question. Yesterday, Equality Florida announced that they had reached a compromise agreement with the governor there to repeal or neutralize the quote unquote "Don't Say Gay" bill. Can you tell us a little bit about that? What did we learn from that fight? Is it an exhaustion with these? With these issues, is it just the hard work of Equality Florida and NCLR and others? And what can we learn from that and to use in other states?
Yeah, great question. And it is really good news, the settlement agreement that's been reached. So in drafting Florida's Don't Say Gay or Trans law, they very purposefully wrote it in very broad, kind of loose ways that could be interpreted in a bunch of different ways. And what that meant was local school districts and teachers were afraid of repercussions for even, entirely clearly allowable content. And because of that chilling effect that it had on local school districts, Equality Florida and their partners were able to sue and to reach an agreement that really clarifies a lot of the aspects of the law that were very clearly unconstitutional and unallowable. So I don't know a lot about the details of it, but I do know that it is going to have a really big impact on schools, making sure that gay-straight alliances are clearly able to meet in school, making sure that anti-bullying protections are still in place for LGBTQ+ students who are among the most frequent victims, and making sure that free speech, which of course our First Amendment protects, is clearly continuing to apply to students and teachers. So I think it is a model. It takes a lot of work to be able to bring a case like that. And, we're really grateful for National Center for Lesbian Rights and the other litigation groups in the movement that partner with us to get that work done.
Thank you. Representative Schofield, what have you found has been effective in working with your colleagues on the other side of the aisle around some of these more Christian nationalist pieces of legislation? I think sometimes people think if that all Republicans or all conservatives kind of fall into that category, but have you found some success in working with people across the aisle, and what can people on the ground, everyday folks who might have a more conservative representative take away from that to try to work with them to convince them otherwise in their own districts?
Yeah, I think it's just a matter of their different tools and strategies. It takes time. You've got to nurture the relationships. And so it isn't a marathon. So sometimes it won't necessarily be me. I've got to send somebody else in and let them do the talking. Sometimes it will be me backing down a little bit, or me going in with someone else. So find some other advocates, some other voices. Sometimes it's just several meetings. One of the things that I learned in trying to work across the aisle was, it took me, and you're not going to believe this, it took me 8 years to get a bill passed. And that was before I was elected. And every year I would go back to a Republican and I would sit down and she would say, "Kim, why do you keep coming here? You know what the outcome is going to be." I was like, "Well, every year I just want to hear about how your tomatoes are growing." And it's so to those that are on this call that get frustrated, there are 99 ways to get things done. You just have to find what tool works at the right time. And so sometimes I can take 2 or 3 people in there. Sometimes it only takes one person. Sometimes it's a day. Sometimes it'll take a couple of weeks. Just keep switching your strategies. And so that's what I want to say. The best way is to change your messaging every once in a while, but also change the people that are bringing in the message that you're bringing in with you. Okay, so it's not just a one and done. It may take a minute. Every no is not a no. In the legislative cycle, just because they say no, it doesn't mean it's done. It doesn't mean it's over. It doesn't mean it's flat. We don't flatline anything. There's always a way to bring it back. So
I think that is
I
think that is the perfect note to end on. I want to thank all of our panelists, Nick, Representative Schofield, Daniel, Ian, for being here and a part of this discussion. A reminder to everyone here that this webinar was recorded and you all receive a link tomorrow to the recording. We'll also include a few links in there to some of the resources that we talked about tonight. If you like what you heard, I wanted to remind folks that registration is open for the 2024 Summit for Religious Freedom, or SURF, spelled SRF. Again, that's April 13th through the 16th. It's in DC, but it is also available virtually. If you're a student with a .edu address, registration is free. We have scholarships available for both virtual and in-person attendance as well. Again, SURF's our hub for our collective fight for the issues that we're talking about here and more, to push back against Christian nationalism and protect church-state separation and inclusive religious freedom. You can visit www.thesurf, that's the SRF.org, to see the schedule, our keynote speakers, our seminars and workshops, as well as register. And a reminder, again, that virtual registration for students with a .edu address is free. With that being said, I want to thank you all for being here. Thank you again to our panelists, and have a wonderful evening. Bye-bye.